Usually when we approach a religious framework or really any kind of ancient moral system, there is this certain expectation of, well, precision, right? We look for the engineering, we want the blueprint, we expect to be handed this clear list of rules, maybe a set of defined rituals, and this understanding that the whole thing operates on a binary switch.
Yeah.
You follow the rules, you are on the inside, you break the rules, you're on the outside. It's clean, it's visible. Everything can just be categorized neatly on a spreadsheet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we find an immense amount of psychological comfort in systems like that where our standing can be quantified, because if righteousness or loyalty is just a matter of outward behavior, well, then we can measure it, right? We can say, I offered this many sacrifices, or I observed these specific holy days, and therefore my cosmic ledger is perfectly balanced.
Right. But then you step into the world of biblical history and you hit this concept known as the New Covenant. And the moment you do that neat, tidy little checklist just completely shatters, because we are no longer looking at an external spreadsheet.
Right.
Right. We find ourselves in a spiritual and historical landscape that is incredibly messy. It's deeply visceral and entirely internal. We move away from laws carved into cold stone tablets and plunge straight into the murky, unpredictable workings of the human heart.
It really does force a complete reevaluation of how ancient people understood loyalty and how they processed failure, and ultimately, how they conceptualized transformation itself. It requires us to completely abandon the idea that behavior modification is the ultimate goal, which is a huge shift.
So welcome everyone to our deep dive for today, where we are going to decode one of the most sweeping, mind-bending concepts in biblical history. But here is the catch for you listening. If you are scanning the table of contents in a Bible, you are not going to find a book titled The New Covenant. You can't just flip to an index, turn to page 500, and read a neat legal charter in one sitting. It is not a standalone document. The academic and theological sources we are analyzing today describe this as a canonical theological reality.
Right, which is a very academic way of saying it's a programmatic theme. It's a concept that acts like a thread weaving a massive tapestry together. It's explicitly named for the very first time by a prophet named Jeremiah. But the roots of it actually go all the way back to the beginning of the biblical narrative. It develops over centuries of intense historical trauma. It explodes into physical reality in the first century accounts of Jesus. It gets unpacked and debated in letters sent all across the Roman Empire, and it continues to unfold. So you really have to trace it as this massive historical rescue operation.
And the mission for our deep dive today is to map out exactly how that rescue operation happened. We want to trace how a literal, fiery geopolitical disaster in the ancient Middle East ended up birthing a spiritual revolution, a revolution that somehow bridged the unimaginable gap between the ashes of ancient Israel, a tense dining room in Roman-occupied Jerusalem, and the intensely digital modern world that you, the listener, are navigating right now.
And to really grasp the magnitude of this, we have to lay down the grand narrative arc first. The biblical text operates on this redemptive historical progression. So the roadmap basically starts with the idea of a perfect creation moves to the preservation of a fractured humanity. Through the story of Noah narrows down to a localized promise made to a man named Abraham, and then solidifies into a massive national treaty at Mount Sinai with the giving of the law, and eventually you get the grand Davidic kingdom that is the towering setup for the whole story.
But the setup fractures. Right, the system breaks down. We hit this era of prophetic indictment, where the architects of this ancient society realize the whole building is fundamentally flawed and that failure necessitates a new promise. Centuries later, we see the claim that this promise was enacted by Christ, leading to the birth of the early church and pointing toward an ultimate future restoration of all things out. So let's unpack this. Why should you, the listener, care about an ancient covenant? Well, because beneath the ancient terminology, this is fundamentally a story about human limits. It is a profound diagnosis of why our attempts to fix ourselves and our societies through external rule following almost always end in disaster. So to understand how we get the cure, we have to start with the disease. We're jumping into the deep end, taking you back to the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. The kingdom of Judah is facing a terminal crisis. The world order is completely collapsing.
Yeah, the geopolitical meat grinder of the ancient Near East during this period is honestly difficult to overstate. For a long time, the Assyrian Empire had been the undisputed, terrifying superpower of the world. But Assyria is suddenly in a state of rapid, violent decline, and in its place, Babylon is rising, and Babylon is voracious. It is an unstoppable imperial force determined to conquer absolutely everything in its path. And then down in the south, you have Egypt, which is this aging superpower trying desperately to flex its muscles and reclaim its former glory.
And right in the middle of this clash of titans is the tiny kingdom of Judah. They are geographically and politically squeezed, acting as a buffer state on a chessboard where the pieces are moving with terrifying speed.
Exactly. And Judah tries to play the political game. They align with Egypt, they rebel against Babylon, and it leads to a series of devastating, catastrophic events. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon lays siege to Jerusalem. You have the initial deportations in 597 BCE, where the elite, the artisans, and the royal family are dragged hundreds of miles away into exile. And then a decade later, the absolute unthinkable happens. The final siege in 586 BCE. Babylon breaches the walls, slaughters the inhabitants, and utterly destroys Jerusalem. And most devastatingly, they burn Solomon's temple to the ground.
Let's pause on that destruction of the temple because for a modern listener, a destroyed building is a tragedy. Sure, it's a loss of historical architecture. But for the ancient Judean, this was a psychological and theological nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a building. This was the literal geographical intersection of heaven and earth.
Right. The temple was the actual mechanism by which they maintained their relationship with God. And you have to look at the religious environment of Jerusalem. Right before the Babylonians broke through those walls, the temple was fully operational. The daily sacrifices were happening on a strict schedule. The incense was burning. The choirs were singing to anyone walking through the courtyards. The religious machinery was operating at peak efficiency.
It looked like everything was fine, like perfectly fine.
It looked perfect, yeah, but the prophets, specifically figures like Jeremiah, were screaming into the void that the people were simultaneously practicing rampant idolatry in secret and gross social injustice in public. The outward religious machinery, those perfectly executed sacrifices, it was merely masking a deeply broken relationship. The leaders and the people suffered from a fatal presumption. They believed that because they possessed the physical temple of God, they possessed a cosmic insurance policy against the Babylonian army.
They thought they were untouchable because they were going through the motions. The checklist was checked, so they believed the enemy couldn't possibly win. But the historical record shows us just how fast that illusion shattered the archaeological evidence. We have perfectly captures the sheer terror when they realized the insurance policy was void. We have these artifacts called Lachish letters, right?
Yes, the Lachish ostraka are some of the most haunting artifacts from the ancient world. An ostrakon is essentially a broken piece of pottery used as scrap paper in the late 7th and early 6th century BCE. Writing materials like papyrus were incredibly expensive, so soldiers would literally just write on broken sherds of clay with ink.
When you read translations of these letters, it feels like reading frantic text messages sent from a doomed military outpost. The tone is pure panic.
Absolutely. We have a letter from a subordinate military commander named Hoshea writing to his superior at the fortified city of Lachish. He writes, "We are watching for the fire signals of Lachish, for we cannot see Azekah," and Azekah was another fortress just down the road.
Oh man, so the fire signals going out means the neighboring fortress has fallen, the Babylonians have taken it, the darkness is closing in, and they know Lachish and eventually Jerusalem are next.
The existential dread in that broken piece of pottery is just palpable. And to corroborate the grim aftermath of this panic, we can actually look to the very center of the Babylonian Empire itself. Archaeologists excavating near the Ishtar Gate in ancient Babylon discovered administrative clay tablets dating to the 6th century BCE. These tablets meticulously list the daily food rations given to prisoners and dependents of the royal court, and among the names listed receiving rations of oil and barley is Jehoiachin, the exiled king of Judah, along with his sons.
It is stunning, concrete, undeniable proof of the exile to exile. The son of Judah, a descendant of David, reduced to a line item on a Babylonian grocery list. This wasn't a theological metaphor for the prophets. This was a historical lived nightmare. They lost their land, their king, their temple, and their freedom, which brings me to a massive foundational question. I think any logical person looking at this wreckage would ask if God had already made a covenant with the Israelites at Mount Sinai centuries earlier. The famous Ten Commandments, the laws given to Moses, was that covenant defective? Why did it need a reboot if I hire a contractor to build a house and a hurricane comes and the house collapses? I don't blame the people living inside. I blame the blueprint was the Sinai covenant, just a poorly drafted legal contract that expired and needed to be completely renegotiated.
That is a very natural modern assumption, right? We view contracts as transactional documents designed to limit liability, but that fundamentally misunderstands the mechanism of ancient covenants. We have to look at the broader ancient Near Eastern treaty parallels, particularly the sovereign vassal treaties utilized by the Hittite and Assyrian empires.
How did those work exactly?
Well, in the ancient world, when a great king, a sovereign, conquered or allied with a lesser king, a vassal, they didn't just sign a trade agreement, they entered into a covenant. These treaties were highly juridical, meaning they had very strict stipulations, demands for absolute loyalty, and severe causes outlined for rebellion. But they were also profoundly relational. They utilized family language. The great king would call the vassal my son, and the vassal would call the sovereign my father.
So it's not just sign on the dotted line and pay your taxes. It's, you are now my people. I am your ultimate protector, and if you betray me, the consequences will be absolute.
Exactly. Therefore, the failure of the Sinai covenant was not a failure in its divine design or its blueprint. The law given at Sinai was considered pure and good. It was a reflection of the sovereign's character. The failure was entirely human unfaithfulness. The people broke the loyalty oath. They worshipped other deities and exploited the vulnerable in their society.
So the hurricane didn't destroy the house because the blueprint was bad. The house collapsed because the tenants deliberately took sledgehammers to the load-bearing pillars.
That's a perfect way to put it. When the prophets begin speaking about a new covenant, they are not implying that the sovereign made a mistake at Sinai. They are highlighting a fatal flaw in the human participant. The old system of external laws, the rules written on stone tablets, could only act as a mirror. It could show the people what righteousness looked like, and it could show them the dirt on their faces, but a mirror cannot wash your face, right? The external system could condemn them, but it couldn't actually make them righteous.
The old system needed more than just a behavioral reform or a fresh coat of paint. It needed a fundamental rewrite of the human being. Which leads us to the impossible question: how do you fix a broken people when their entire world, their identity, their capital city has just been reduced to ash? You don't just hand them a new list of rules that clearly didn't work the first time. You have to do something much more invasive.
And that introduces us to the prophetic architects of this new reality. The primary voices are Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and it is crucial to remember the context here. They are not prophesying from a place of victory. They are speaking right into the teeth of the exile. They're literally sitting in the rubble. And it is here in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, that the explicit Hebrew phrase, Berit Odisha, which literally translates to New Covenant, is spoken for the very first time in the biblical record.
This text in Jeremiah is a masterpiece. It is not just a dry theological declaration. It is a brilliantly constructed literary work of art. The structure of the poetry itself contains the message we are looking at, what scholars call a chiastic structure.
Yeah, the chiasm is vital to understanding where Jeremiah is placing his emphasis for anyone unfamiliar. A chiasm is an ancient literary device where ideas are presented in a specific sequence and then repeated in reverse order. It looks like a staircase going up, reaching a landing, and then mirroring the same steps going down to A, B, C, D, and then C, B, A.
The whole structure is designed to draw your eye, not to the beginning or the end, but to the center point, right? The landing, the D. So let's walk up the stairs of Jeremiah's prophecy. Step A is the future time promise. Jeremiah says the days are coming. Step B is the new covenant with Israel and Judah. Step C is the contrast, unlike the Sinai covenant, which the people broke.
And then we hit the pivot point, the absolute center of the chiasm, step D. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts.
The law written on the heart.
Yes. After that center point, the staircase descends, mirroring the concepts. Step C prime matches the contrast with the new reality, universal knowledge of the Lord. Step B prime matches the covenant promise with total forgiveness of sins. And step A prime brings us back to the ultimate relational goal. I will be their God and they will be my people. Everything in that glorious promise hinges on the center pivot.
Let's talk about that center pivot. Let's talk about the word heart. Because in our modern Western culture, the heart is entirely associated with romance, sentimentality, emotion. It's the organ of Hallmark cards and pop songs, right? If I say I am following my heart, I usually mean I am abandoning logic to do what feels good in the moment. But the ancient Hebrew word used here, lev or levav, means something profoundly different.
The cultural translation here is essential in ancient Near Eastern anatomy and anthropology. They didn't really know the function of the brain. They actually believed the kidneys were the seat of raw emotion. But the lev, the heart, was the command center of the human person. It was the seat of the intellect, the will, the thought process, and your deepest driving desires. The heart is where you calculate, where you formulate intent, and where you make your core decisions.
So when Jeremiah says the law will be written on the lev, he's not saying people are suddenly going to have warm, fuzzy feelings about God's rules.
Not at all. He is talking about an internal rewiring of human volition under the Old Covenant. The law was an external demand written on cold stone tablets. It stood outside of you demanding compliance while your internal desires pulled you in the opposite direction. The result was constant friction and inevitable failure. But if the law is written on the lev, it becomes your internal operating desire. You obey not out of fear of a curse, but because the very core of your decision-making process has been transformed to desire what the sovereign desires.
It makes me think of trying to fix a deeply flawed piece of technology, like the Sinai Covenant was like trying to fix a computer that is riddled with malware by taping a fresh list of rules to the outside of the monitor, hoping the computer somehow reads the sticky note and decides to stop crashing.
Yeah.
Jeremiah and Ezekiel are realizing that is impossible. They're saying God is going to pry open the casing, rip out the corrupted hardware, and install a brand new operating system from the inside out.
That analogy perfectly captures the necessity of the internal work. And Ezekiel, who is a contemporary of Jeremiah, prophesying to the exiles actually living in Babylon, takes this hardware swap even further. Ezekiel's imagery is deeply visceral in Ezekiel chapters 36 and 37. He adds elements that Jeremiah didn't foreground as explicitly mapping out a profound sequence of restoration.
Ezekiel's sequence feels almost medical. First, he says God will regather the people from where they have been scattered. Second, God will cleanse them with clean water, washing away the accumulated filth of their idolatry. And then we hit the surgery. God says, I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh.
The heart of stone is a devastating anthropological diagnosis. I mean, a stone does not beat a stone, it's impenetrable. A stone does not respond to physical stimuli. You can strike it, you can yell at it, you can plead with it, but it remains cold and dead. Ezekiel is stating that humanity in its natural rebellious state is morally and spiritually dead to God. The patient is essentially flatlining.
You can't rehabilitate a stone, you have to remove it.
Which is why the promise is not a heart massage. It is a heart transplant. God gives a heart of flesh, living, beating, responsive tissue, and Ezekiel adds one more crucial element to this sequence. God says, I will put my spirit within you, the Hebrew word rush, or the Greek equivalent pneuma. The very life breath of the divine will take up residence inside the human person, providing the actual power to walk in the statutes of the covenant. Furthermore, Ezekiel introduces the promise of a coming Davidic shepherd prince to lead this renewed people in a covenant of peace.
It is breathtaking imagery, the Valley of Dry Bones coming back to life. But we have to crash back into the historical reality for a moment because these prophecies were soaring, magnificent promises, but they were spoken to depressed exiles living in the dusty settlements of a foreign empire. And the harsh truth is, for centuries, they sat there as an unfulfilled promise, a beautiful, haunting expectation deferred.
Yeah, the waiting period was long and grueling. Empires rose and fell. Babylon eventually fell to the Medes and Persians. The Persians allowed some of the Judeans to return and rebuild Jerusalem. Then the Persians fell to Alexander the Great and the Greeks. And eventually we fast forward several hundred years to the 1st century CE. The Jewish people are back in their ancestral land, but they are under the crushing weight of a new iron-fisted superpower, Rome.
The world of Second Temple Judaism, right? If you look at Jerusalem, during this time, the temple has been rebuilt. It's massive and beautiful thanks to Herod the Great. The sacrifices are functioning again. The priesthood is active. The local synagogues are bustling to an outsider. It looks like the religion is fully recovered. But beneath the surface, there is this pervasive aching sense among many Jewish groups that the true ultimate restoration, the new covenant with the new heart and the indwelling spirit that Jeremiah and Ezekiel promised, hasn't fully arrived.
They are geographically back in the Promised Land, but spiritually and politically, many feel like they are still living in a sort of prolonged exile. They're heavily taxed, oppressed by Roman governors, and their own religious leadership is often deeply compromised by political corruption. They are desperately waiting for the Davidic shepherd. They are waiting for the heart transplant.
Enter Jesus of Nazareth. We are shifting from a massive, sweeping geopolitical narrative spanning centuries to incredibly intimate tents, setting a small upper room in Jerusalem. The Last Supper. We read about this in the Gospel accounts of Luke and Matthew. Jesus is sitting at a table with a dozen of his closest disciples. He knows he's going to be betrayed. He knows he's going to be executed by the state. And in the middle of this meal, he picks up a cup of wine and explicitly connects his impending violent death to Jeremiah's ancient promise.
He uses the Greek phrase, "daithekakain," the new covenant.
Let's talk about the mechanics of this scene, because the setting is everything. They aren't just having a casual dinner. This is a Passover meal. Yeah.
Right. And to the Jewish mind, Passover is the ultimate foundational narrative of national liberation. It looks back centuries to the Exodus, to the night the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. The story centers on the blood of an unblemished lamb painted on the doorposts of their homes, which saved them from the angel of death. It was the meal that preceded their deliverance from physical slavery by choosing this exact highly charged moment to enact his promise. Jesus is intentionally merging the ancient themes of liberation, sacrifice, and covenant ratification.
But he is fundamentally shifting the focal point of the meal.
Well,
He is essentially saying this festival is no longer just about looking back at liberation from a human pharaoh in Egypt. This is about looking right now at a liberation from the exile of sin, the tyranny of a heart of stone, which brings us to the bread and the wine.
Jesus breaks the bread and says, "This is my body given for you." And then he takes the cup and says, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." This puts the entire mechanism of how a person is actually saved, the theology of rescue and atonement, front and center. Jesus is not acting merely as a rabbi or a teacher giving a theological lecture about Jeremiah. He is acting as the mediator of the covenant. He is acting as the high priest, and most shockingly, he is offering himself as the actual ratifying sacrifice.
Let's dig into the why and how of that why blood. I think for a modern listener, the idea of a covenant sealed in blood sounds barbaric, or at least deeply ritualistic and strange. Why couldn't Jesus just declare the covenant open? Why did it require his death?
We have to understand how ancient covenants were ratified. They were almost never just signed with ink. They were cut with blood in the ancient mindset. The life of a creature is in its blood when you entered into a serious treaty. Animals were often sacrificed and divided. The blood signified the absolute seriousness of the oath. It was a self-maledictory curse, meaning, "May my blood be spilled like this animal if I break this treaty."
Wow, a literal vow of life and death.
Yes, and furthermore, within the Levitical system established at Sinai, blood provided the specific mechanism for atonement and cleansing. It was the designated covering for the cost of human rebellion when Jesus says, "The new covenant is in my blood." He is declaring that his imminent death on the cross is the ultimate substitutionary sacrifice. The prophets said the penalty for a broken covenant was death. Jesus is stepping into the place of the covenant breaker, taking the curse upon himself. His blood is the mechanism that legally and spiritually secures the forgiveness that Jeremiah promised.
I want to push back on this on behalf of someone trying to logically connect the dots. We started with Jeremiah and Ezekiel prophesying about massive national restoration, the physical regathering of millions of people, a geopolitical promise made specifically to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And now we're in a tiny, dimly lit room eating bread, drinking wine in a deeply personal, almost quiet moment. How does a single meal among a few men actually enact a millennia-old prophetic promise? How does this not just radically shrink the grand vision?
It's a vital question, and it doesn't shrink the vision. Rather, it condenses it into its most potent, concentrated form so that it can eventually expand globally. Jesus is redefining the center of gravity for the people of God under the Old Covenant. The center of the community was a physical building, the temple in Jerusalem, and a specific genealogical line. Jesus is asserting that the new center of the covenant is himself, his person, and his work.
So the temple isn't a building of stone anymore.
Exactly. The family is now built around table fellowship, the continuous remembrance of Christ's sacrifice, and the shared experience of definitive forgiveness. And this forgiveness is the bedrock of the whole system.
Let's talk about the nature of that forgiveness, because the sources highlight a very specific Hebrew concept from Jeremiah 31.34 that Jesus is fulfilling here. The word is salah.
Salah is a profound, uniquely divine concept in biblical Hebrew. It is almost exclusively used to describe God's forgiveness, never human forgiveness. It means to forgive and to remember the sin no more. It is not just a pragmatic overlooking of a fault or deciding not to punish someone while still holding a grudge. It is a divine, intentional non-imputation of sin.
Non-imputation meaning the debt is completely wiped from the ledger.
It is God declaring that the breach of the covenant will never again be held against the person the legal record is destroyed when Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. He's saying his sacrifice is what legally purchases that salah, the heart transplant Ezekiel promised, is only possible because the crushing debt of the old covenant failure has been fully absorbed and removed by Christ.
Okay, so Jesus enacts this in a small room in Jerusalem. The historical accounts tell us he is crucified the next day, and 3 days later, his followers claim he resurrected from the dead. The early church is born in Judea, but we have a major historical and cultural leap to make here. How did this localized, deeply Jewish theological concept, born out of the trauma of Babylon and enacted at a Jewish Passover meal, become a global reality within a single lifetime? You have Greeks, Romans, and people from all over the Mediterranean claiming this new covenant for themselves. They had no connection to Mount Sinai. They had no connection to Jeremiah. How did it jump the cultural firewall?
To understand that leap, we have to move outward to the apostolic interpretation. We have to examine how the early leaders of the church, specifically figures like the Apostle Paul and the anonymous author of Hebrews, took this explosive new reality and translated it for a rapidly expanding, ethnically diverse church.
Let's start with Paul. Paul was a Pharisee, a brilliantly educated Jewish scholar who becomes the primary missionary to the Gentile non-Jewish world. We are looking at a letter he wrote to the church in Corinth. Corinth is a bustling, wealthy Greek port city. It is full of pagan temples, intense philosophical debates, and it is culturally light years away from the rabbinic schools of Jerusalem in his second letter to them specifically, 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Paul makes a fascinating short contrast. He compares the Old Covenant, which he explicitly associates with Moses, to the New Covenant.
And the language he uses is startling, especially for a former Pharisee.
It really is. He calls the Old Covenant a ministry that brought death written with letters engraved on stone. He literally calls it a fading glory. And he contrasts that with the New Covenant, which he calls a spirit-giving ministry.
It is a striking passage that requires very careful interpretive nuance when Paul talks about the letters of stone bringing death. A crucial question arises, is Paul suddenly demonstrating anti-Torah contempt? Is he saying the law of God, the Ten Commandments, are inherently bad or evil?
It sounds like he's throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
But he isn't, and understanding why is key. The Torah, the divine instruction given at Sinai, is not abolished. Remember, the center of Jeremiah's chiasm, the law isn't thrown away, it is internalized. The problem with the letters of stone was not the letters themselves. The problem was that they were external to a people who lacked the internal spirit. If you introduce a perfect holy law that demands absolute perfection to a human heart that is naturally rebellious, a heart of stone, the inevitable result is failure, condemnation, and ultimately death. The law acts as a prosecuting attorney. It cannot give you the life it demands.
So the glory of the Old Covenant was real, but it was fading. Paul uses the story of Moses coming down from the mountain. Moses' face was glowing with the glory of God, but the glow eventually faded.
Yes, the Old Covenant administration was glorious because it originated from God, but it was provisional. It was designed to be temporary, pointing to something greater. The New Covenant is vastly superior because it is a spirit-giving ministry, fulfilling Ezekiel's precise promise. God's own spirit now indwells the believer. It empowers the Gentile in Corinth, who has no Jewish heritage, to actually live out the righteous intent of the law from a transformed heart. The power source is changed.
If Paul's language in 2 Corinthians sounds strong, the book of Hebrews takes it to an entirely different level. Let's explore Hebrews chapters 8 through 10. The audience here is completely different from Corinth. The author is writing to Jewish Christians who are exhausted. They are facing severe persecution, social ostracization, and they are heavily tempted to just abandon this new Christian movement and go back to the safety and familiarity of the old temple system in Jerusalem.
The author of Hebrews recognizes this immense temptation, and in response, he builds a cumulative, devastatingly logical argument. His goal is to prove that going backwards is not just a bad idea, it is a theological impossibility.
He argues that Christ mediates a better covenant enacted on better promises in a heavenly sanctuary.
In chapter 8, the author quotes the entirety of Jeremiah 31.31 to 34. He does this to prove from the Hebrew scriptures themselves that God always intended to replace the Sinai system. He argues that the earthly temple in Jerusalem, the Levitical priests, the endless daily rivers of animal blood, all of it was just a shadow. It was an earthly replica, a scale model of a massive heavenly reality.
The shadow versus the reality.
Exactly. The argument is that Christ, acting as the ultimate superior high priest, does not enter a temple built by human hands. He enters the true heavenly sanctuary, and he offers a superior sacrifice himself, not daily, but once for all time, achieving an eternal redemption that the blood of bulls and goats could never actually secure.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here because the language the author uses is intense. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13 says, by calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. Obsolete, outdated. That sounds incredibly harsh. If I am a first century Jewish person, does that mean the entire history of my ancestors, the Torah, the centuries of temple worship was just a massive, bloody mistake that God finally decided to discard?
That is a very common misunderstanding, but if we connect this to the broader biblical theology, we have to read the text carefully. The text is emphasizing the obsolescence of the old sacrificial order and the old administrative system. It is not declaring the erasure of God's historical faithfulness, and it certainly isn't saying God made a mistake.
How do we separate the two?
Think of it through the analogy of construction scaffolding. If you are building a magnificent cathedral, you erect a massive system of steel scaffolding around it. The scaffolding is essential. It provides the framework, the structure, the access points necessary to build the actual building. But once the cathedral is finished, once the capstone is placed, what do you do with the scaffolding?
You take it down.
You take it down, and you don't take it down because it was a mistake or because it was evil. You take it down because it has perfectly served its purpose. The old covenant was the scaffolding. It was a diagnostic tool designed to reveal human sin and prepare the way for the solution. Christ is the finished building. He is the fulfillment. The message of Hebrews is about fulfillment, not cancellation. Returning to the animal sacrifices of the Old Covenant after Christ has offered himself would be like choosing to live outside in the cold scaffolding when the doors to the finished cathedral are wide open. It would be like staring at a shadow on the wall when the actual person casting the shadow has walked into the room.
The shadow versus the reality, that scaffolding analogy clears up a tremendous amount of tension. But exploring these ancient texts raises another fascinating, incredibly pragmatic point. We're sitting here today reading these sweeping theological arguments in polished English translations. We have 2,000 years of church history and millions of books backing us up. But how did these ancient expectations actually survive the chaotic, violent centuries between Jeremiah writing in the ashes of Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE and Jesus sitting in that upper room in the 1st century CE?
It is a miraculous story of textual preservation for a very long time. Historians and theologians only had the finalized biblical texts themselves and copies from the Middle Ages to rely on for that interim period. We had a massive historical blind spot, but then in the mid-20th century, the narrative changed entirely. We get one of the greatest, if not the greatest, archaeological discoveries in human history.
We are taking the listener into the dirt. Now we are leaving the theological heights and going to the harsh, arid cliffs near the Dead Sea. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are manuscripts found in caves at a site called Qumran, dating roughly from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE.
The Qumran community, often identified by scholars as the Essenes, was a strict apocalyptic Jewish sect. They were deeply disillusioned with the religious establishment. They believed the priesthood in Jerusalem had become corrupt, Hellenized, and politically compromised, so they withdrew entirely. They went out into the harsh desert near the Dead Sea to form an isolated community of purity, waiting for God to intervene in history. And crucially for us, they built a massive library storing their scrolls in clay jars hidden in the surrounding caves.
When Bedouin shepherds and later archaeologists discovered these caves in the 1940s and 50s, it sent shockwaves through the academic world. And regarding our topic of the New Covenant, 2 major archaeological facts emerged in the dust of Qumran. The first has to do with the physical text of the book of Jeremiah itself.
This is where textual criticism becomes fascinating. When scholars began unrolling and examining the ancient scrolls of Jeremiah found at Qumran, they realized something surprising. There wasn't just one perfectly uniform, standardized ancient text circulating in the centuries before Christ.
Let's break that down. Before Qumran, we primarily relied on 2 traditions for the Old Testament. We had the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text that was meticulously preserved by Jewish scribes in the Middle Ages, which most of our modern English Old Testaments are translated from. And we had the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible used widely by Jews in the Greco-Roman world and by the early Christians.
But the Greek Septuagint version of Jeremiah is significantly different from the Hebrew Masoretic text. The Greek version is about 1/8 shorter, entire passages are missing, and the chapters containing the prophecies against foreign nations are arranged in a completely different order for a long time. Scholars debated, did the Greek translators just ruthlessly edit the text, or were they translating from a different older Hebrew version that was lost to history?
And Qumran provided the answer. In those caves, they found Hebrew manuscripts of Jeremiah that aligned perfectly with the longer traditional Masoretic version. But right alongside them, they found other Hebrew manuscripts of Jeremiah that aligned with the shorter, differently arranged Greek version.
It was stunning proof of textual fluidity. It demonstrated that in the ancient Second Temple world, the book of Jeremiah circulated in multiple, slightly different editions.
Which inevitably begs a massive question for anyone seeking historical reliability. It's like finding the director's cut and the heavily edited theatrical release of the same movie hidden in a vault if the text is that fluid. If scribes were producing different editions, does this mean the core prophecy of the New Covenant is unreliable? Did some later editor just splice Jeremiah 31 in to support a new theological agenda?
It is a completely fair question, but the evidence from Qumran actually provides massive reassurance on this front. While the texts show fluidity in the overall length of the book and the arrangement of certain chapters, the core theology of Jeremiah 31, the specific promise of the New Covenant, the law written on the heart, remains entirely stable and present across all the textual witnesses, the director's cut, and the theatrical release. Both contain the exact same central pivotal scene. The textual fluidity doesn't undermine the theology. It simply gives us a much more accurate, realistic picture of how ancient scribes reverently preserved and transmitted sacred texts in different communities.
That is incredibly reassuring. And the second major find at Qumran was just as explosive. It wasn't just biblical scrolls they found. It was their own sectarian documents.
Yes. The documents the community wrote themselves to govern their daily lives and articulate their theology texts, like the Community Rule and the Damascus document. These texts are phenomenal because they prove unequivocally that the Second Temple world was already deeply, thoroughly saturated with New Covenant hopes long before Jesus was born.
The Essenes of Qumran in some of their writings actually refer to themselves explicitly as the community of the New Covenant in the land of Damascus. They believed they were the faithful remnant living out this promise.
This completely dismantles a very old skeptical argument. You used to hear the idea that the New Covenant was some late Gentile Christian invention cooked up decades after Jesus died to justify breaking away from Judaism. Qumran proves that is historically false.
Right.
The language of the New Covenant was a live, burning, intensely debated Jewish hope when Jesus stands up in the upper room and says, "This is the New Covenant in my blood." He is not inventing a new religion on the spot out of thin air. He is stepping directly into a centuries-old, highly anticipated, distinctly Jewish theological framework, and he is making the audacious claim to be the definitive fulfillment of it.
Knowing that this was such a deeply anticipated, specifically Jewish hope we have to tackle the elephant in the room, this is one of the most significant interpretive debates surrounding the biblical text. Who exactly gets to claim this new covenant today?
This is an area where we have to tread carefully and outline the debate with strict neutrality, because how you answer this question has massive implications for how different groups read their Bibles, understand theology, and even view modern geopolitics. The fundamental question theologians grapple with is, who is the new covenant? Ultimately, for broadly speaking, there are three main views.
And I want to emphasize for you, the listeners, we explore this. We are looking at these strictly through the lens of the theological text, provided we are not endorsing any specific modern political viewpoints or movements. We are simply reporting on the theological logic behind how different traditions interpret these ancient promises.
Yeah.
So let's look at the first view.
The first view argues that the new covenant is intended for national Israel, only the logic here is straightforward and textually rooted. They point out that Jeremiah 31 explicitly says, "I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." It doesn't mention Rome or Greece or America under this view. While the Christian church might currently benefit from the spiritual blessings of Christ's death, the actual literal fulfillment of the new covenant still awaits a future geopolitical and spiritual restoration of national Israel. The argument is that God made specific promises to the physical descendants of Abraham, and God cannot renege on those physical promises.
Okay, the second view takes a very different approach.
A radically different approach. The second view argues that the new covenant is for the church. Only this perspective focuses heavily on the writings of Paul in the book of Hebrews. The logic is that the physical nation of Israel was always intended to be a temporary physical metaphor pointing toward a permanent spiritual reality. The church proponents of this view argue that the church made up of believing Jews and Gentiles from every nation has become the new Israel, or the true Israel. Therefore, the church inherits all the covenant promises made to Israel, effectively replacing national Israel in God's programmatic timeline.
Which brings us to the third view. The theological source material we are referencing today seems to lean toward this third option as a necessary synthesis, a unity with distinction model.
This third model attempts to hold the tension of both realities together without erasing either one. It acknowledges the valid points of both previous views. First, it affirms that Jeremiah undeniably spoke to the physical descendants of Israel and Judah, and that God's historical faithfulness to the Jewish people is not erased or discarded. However, it also recognizes that the New Testament clearly presents the radical, unexpected inclusion of the Gentiles into this covenant through faith in Christ without requiring those Gentiles to adopt ethnic Jewish markers like circumcision.
It's the idea that the tent was suddenly pitched wide enough to cover everyone, fulfilling the ancient promise to Abraham that he would be a blessing to all nations.
Precisely the logic. The new covenant opens the blessing of the Spirit and the forgiveness of sins to all nations, creating a unified people of God. However, it maintains that God has not abandoned his original historical promises to Israel. The source specifically notes, and this is heavily emphasized in Paul's letter to the Romans chapter 11, with his analogy of wild olive branches being grafted into a cultivated olive tree, that the New Testament strictly forbids any arrogance or contempt from Gentile believers toward Israel. The root supports the branches, not the other way around.
It is a profound, beautiful tension, and there is another major interpretive debate nestled in Jeremiah's prophecy that we need to unpack. It revolves around the phrase, No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, for the least of them to the greatest. The Hebrew word for know is yada. Does this mean if you're a participant in the new covenant, you literally don't need teachers, pastors, or theology deep dives like this one anymore? Do we just inherently know everything?
As much as that interpretation might save people a lot of time reading, no, it doesn't mean the end of all instruction to understand this. We have to look at the contrast Jeremiah is making under the Old Covenant administration. You were born into the physical nation of Israel by natural descent. Therefore, you could be a citizen of the covenant without having any personal internal relationship with God. You had to be constantly mediated to. You had to be taught to know the Lord by priests and prophets.
You were in the club by birth, but you had to be taught the handshake.
Right. The word yada implies much more than intellectual data. It implies deep relational experiential recognition. Jeremiah is prophesying that in the New Covenant community, the entry requirement isn't physical birth, but spiritual rebirth. Therefore, everyone who is genuinely part of the covenant will possess a direct, internalized, experiential knowledge of God through the indwelling Spirit. There is no such thing as a New Covenant member who doesn't know God.
So the mediation changes. You don't need a high priest to go into a temple building for you anymore because the Spirit resides within.
Exactly. The source explains that this points to a universal experiential knowledge within the covenant community. However, the New Testament letters make it abundantly clear that present teaching ministries, pastors, and theologians remain absolutely necessary. Why? Because while the core relational knowledge of God is secure, our minds still need to be renewed. We still need to learn the depths of theology, ethics, and community living. The teaching gifts remain necessary to build up the church until the final, ultimate realization of all things, the new creation, where our knowledge will finally be perfect and unmediated.
This brings us to the crucial pivot of our deep dive. We have covered centuries of history, geopolitical collapse, Greek translations, and ancient sacrificial systems. But what does this all mean for us today? We want to bring this ancient blueprint directly into your life right now, because if we are honest, we are living in an era that is deeply, exhaustingly addicted to external performance.
We are arguably more obsessed with visible metrics of righteousness than the ancient world was. We just use different terminology.
We absolutely are. We live in the age of the curated social media feed where your moral standing and your social value are based on visible algorithms. Did you post the right infographic? Did you denounce the right person? We live in an era of what sociologists call moral therapeutic deism, the idea that God exists just to make us feel happy and help us be good people. And we are surrounded by endless mountains of self-help books. If I just buy the correct productivity planner or follow the right hyper-optimized morning routine or say the exact right affirmations in the mirror, I can fix my fundamental brokenness. How does Ezekiel's brutal diagnosis of a heart of stone and the promise of a new heart challenge the way we try to fix ourselves in our society today?
It challenges our modern assumptions at the most foundational, uncomfortable level. The New Covenant narrative acts as a massive disruptor. It declares that social reform, behavioral modification, and institutional continuity, while potentially helpful on a surface level, are fundamentally incomplete solutions. If there is no underlying heart change, you cannot secure your identity or heal the deep-bleeding fractures in our society by mere external rule following.
Because you can't put a Band-Aid on a heart of stone.
You cannot. The biblical diagnosis is that human nature is fundamentally compromised at the root level. If the core operating system is corrupted by selfishness, pride, and a desire for autonomy, then all the external rules in the world will merely restrain the worst impulses. Temporarily, they will never cure the disease. True justice, true enduring mercy, and true societal transformation can only flow from internalized grace.
When the Spirit writes the law on the heart, obedience completely shifts its nature. It is no longer a grudging, fearful compliance to an external threat, like driving the speed limit. Only because you see a police car in your rearview mirror, it becomes the natural, authentic outflow of a transformed desire. The New Covenant tells us the hard truth that we cannot save ourselves, but it pairs that with the beautiful reality that God has initiated a rescue operation from the inside out. Let's briefly recap this incredible, sweeping journey we have been on today. We started in the smoking ashes of a destroyed Jerusalem amidst the catastrophic geopolitical collapse of Judah in the 6th century BCE. We explored the brilliant chiastic poetry of Jeremiah, pointing to a future day when the cold stone tablets will be replaced by a law written directly on the human heart. We watched Ezekiel promise an impossible surgery, a heart of flesh in the breath of the indwelling Spirit.
We saw how that fragile, unfulfilled hope survived the rise and fall of empires meticulously preserved on scrolls hidden in the desert caves of Qumran.
Until Jesus of Nazareth sat in a tense Roman-era dining room, and enacted that millennia-old promise with a cup of wine, identifying his own impending death and substitutionary blood as the legal ratification of the covenant. And we saw how the early church leaders like Paul and the author of Hebrews interpreted this explosive reality as a radical inclusion of the nations, a spear-giving ministry that fulfilled rather than canceled the ancient promises of God. It is from beginning to end the ultimate story of a sovereign God doing for humanity what humanity was utterly, tragically incapable of doing for itself.
It is the grand unifying reality of the entire biblical narrative. It answers the profound problem of human rebellion, not by lowering the standard and not by imposing more draconian rules, but with staggering divine mercy and the internal power of the Spirit.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We discussed earlier that a central non-negotiable pillar of this new covenant is God's specific promise in Jeremiah 31. I will remember their sins no more. The Hebrew concept of Salah, the definitive non-imputation of sin. Think about that for a second in the context of our modern lives. We live in a deeply digital, hyper-connected age where the internet remembers absolutely everything. Every mistake, every bad take, every awkward phase, every momentary failure is permanently archived on a server somewhere, ready to be weaponized at a moment's notice. We live in a culture of relentless cancellation and shifting, unforgiving external purity tests. We have built a society that fundamentally refuses to forgive because it refuses to forget. We demand that people carry the weight of their worst moments forever. Yet the foundational promise of the new covenant is a divine intentional unremembering it. It is the creator of the universe looking at the absolute worst of our failures, our betrayals, and our brokenness, and choosing both legally and relationally to delete the archive. The debt is absorbed, the record is cleared. So here's the question for you to explore on your own in a world that is completely obsessed with remembering every flaw and punishing every misstep. What would it actually mean for you to live as a person formed by an unremembering definitive forgiveness? How would it change the way you view yourself, and how would it change the way you treat the broken people around you? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the new covenant. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep looking beneath the surface.